Good afternoon, and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday Zoom series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis and host of this program. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Ben Wizner, Civil Liberties Advocate with the ACLU in New York. Since 2013, Ben Wizner has been the lead attorney of NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. He is the American lawyer, writer, and civil liberties advocate with the ACLU. He is the director of the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, which works to protect and expand First Amendment freedoms of expression, association, and inquiry, and to ensure that civil liberties are enhanced rather than compromised by new advances in science and technology. For more than 2 decades at the ACLU, Ben has litigated cases involving the right to protest, freedom of expression, online government surveillance practices, airport security policies, targeted killings, which I really want to talk about, and torture. Ben is a graduate of Harvard and New York University School of Law and was a law clerk for the Honorable Stephen Reinhardt of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. So welcome, Ben. It's just a joy to have you with us here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Georgia. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Well, before we get to Snowden, I have a few questions for you about your work. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your background and the type of cases you are working on right now.
Well, in terms of background, I would say that my career has been a series of surprises based on timing. I mean, I became a baby lawyer at the ACLU in August of 2001, just 5 weeks before the 9/11 attacks.
Mhm.
And my intent was, this was in California, actually, at the Los Angeles affiliate of the ACLU. And I was hired to mainly work in the jail system there, which is the world's largest jail system still in Los Angeles County. I ended up doing a lot of incarceration work, but it was Guantanamo and CIA secret prisons more than the LA County jails because uh, the 9/11 attacks and really the government's outrageous response to those attacks um, really shaped the first decade of my career at the ACLU. In 2004, I moved to New York to join the National ACLU and help start what we now call our National Security Project. Litigated or attempted to litigate torture cases against the CIA, extraordinary rendition cases, targeted killing, issues that we would have thought had been resolved in the law decades earlier, but not only were not resolved, but and we can talk about this more. U.S. courts steadfastly refused to answer. In all the torture cases that we brought, no court ever dealt with the legality of the practice. They would dismiss these cases on grounds of secrecy or standing or just some other justiciability doctrine. And then around 2012, the ACLU asked me to head up this new project that we call Speech, Privacy, and Technology, just in time for Edward Snowden to appear on my doorstep. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now my team is working at the intersection of civil liberties and new technologies. We've been trying to bring the Fourth Amendment into the 21st century by putting limits on the government's surveillance power. And obviously, we're doing a huge amount of free speech work, both online free speech, but also in the real world on campuses. That's been obviously a hot spot in the last year, and happy to talk about any and all of this.
Yeah, that's the two things that came to mind as you were talking about that. One are the targeted killings. I don't know if you've had any experience with those kinds of cases, and torture. And of course, the demonstrations that took place on campuses all across the country in the spring, and the heavy-handedness with which some of them have been handled. Can you talk a little bit about any of that before we get on to Snowden?
Sure. I mean, so going back to the question of targeted killing, people will probably remember the case of Anwar al-Awlaki. He was an American citizen born in Las Cruces, New Mexico, who became radicalized sometime after 9/11, moved back to Yemen, and did become, by all appearances, quite a radical preacher there may have been involved with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But in 2010, the Obama administration announced effectively through leaks to the press that al-Awlaki had been added to America's kill lists, that he was on the list of people who the CIA and the Pentagon were trying to identify and kill with drone strikes. At that time, I and some other lawyers traveled to Yemen, met with his father, and decided to bring a lawsuit in U.S. courts to essentially ask the question, under what circumstances can the United States government target one of its own citizens for death, far from any recognized battlefield, based on undisclosed criteria of what puts you onto these kill lists? Our claim was not that killing was per se unlawful, the way torture is per se unlawful. In a way, torture is an easier legal question. It is never legal. It doesn't matter who the person is. Every single time we torture someone in our custody, it's a crime. Killing is a little bit different. As we know, you can kill during warfare. There are privileges that go along with warfare that allow our soldiers to kill other people without being murderers. But this was, to us, an unbelievable stretching of that authority. We were not at war with Yemen. We were not at war in Yemen, unless you believed this idea that we're involved in a war that takes place everywhere and lasts forever. And the idea that we could, without any process whatsoever, and without any announced standards, without even telling a citizen what conduct would subject him to extrajudicial killing by his government, just assassinate this person, seemed to us obviously wrong. And so in our lawsuit, we essentially asked a court for an order saying, in what circumstances would this be legal or not? And as with almost every attempt to bring law to the war on terror, the question before the court was not, when is killing lawful, but do we have a right to be in court? Do we have standing even to be here? Is this a question for courts, or is this a political question? In this case, the court said, whatever the standard is, this is a political question that is left to the political branches, to the executive branch and to Congress, and courts have no role here. And what's interesting is that that's not the approach that courts in other democracies have taken. When human rights lawyers, my colleagues with the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, brought a similar case before the Israeli Supreme Court, the court essentially laid out the criteria for when targeted killings could be lawful and when they were unlawful. No one could say that the U.S. faces graver dangers than that society, but to this day, we have never had a court weigh in on the legality of that practice. All we've had courts say is that it's not a question for courts.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, the thought of having a kill list is kind of horrific, I think, to a lot of us.
Well, and in fact, it shows that we're not talking about imminent threats. If you can put someone on a list and have them be on it for months, we're not talking about something that's going to happen tomorrow, where we have intelligence that we're interrupting an ongoing plot. In some of those circumstances, killing might be lawful, but the idea that we have these shopping lists with names of people and they can stay on there for months or years, shows that this is something other than responding to imminent threats to the country.
Yeah, it does make us very wary of our intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
So now I want to go to Edward Snowden. And first, how did you happen to become his attorney?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the first thing, and then we'll
get. Yeah. So over the course of doing national security work for the ACLU, I got to know almost all of the journalists who cover national security work. And that includes the journalists who ended up reporting on the Snowden story. And so in January of 2013, Laura Poitras said, "Can I come to your office and talk to you face to face?" This is the documentary filmmaker, Laura Poitras. And she came into my office and said, "Can you please leave your phone in the drawer here, and can we go to a coffee shop somewhere nearby?" So we put our phones into my locked drawer and we went to a coffee shop. And then she slid across the table these printed out emails from someone who was calling himself Citizen 4, and said, "What do you make of this?" And people like Laura and me, probably more me than Laura, get lots of emails from people who insist that they're the most important whistleblower of all time and make absolute grandiose claims of the importance of the information they need to share. Um, and what was striking about this is that it wasn't written in that tone at all. Although there was a little bit of lofty language about values, what this person purported to say about his knowledge and about the system was very grounded and concrete. And so, I mean, Laura thought there were three possibilities here. The third was that this person was who he said he was. The first was that it was a crank who was not credible. The second was that she was being set up because of her dissident posture. At that time, she had been on the government's watch lists. Every time she traveled back from outside the United States, she'd be pulled into secondary screening and interrogated about what she had been doing for hours. And so she thought, is this some kind of way to entrap me? My view was it didn't sound like a crank, but one could not be sure. And that if she decided to pursue this and to be in touch with the person and to make plans to meet, she shouldn't do it as a lone wolf, independent documentary filmmaker. She should try to partner with a more mainstream news organization that had a general counsel's office, both because she would then have the benefit of the legal advice that would come from there, but also the U.S. government and the intelligence community have a lot easier time going after and isolating a solo person than they do going after a big institution like, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times. And so that was how Laura ended up reaching out to Bart Gellman, a multiple Pulitzer Prize winner who worked with the Washington Post and ended up traveling with Laura to Hong Kong to meet Snowden in May of 2013. I will tell you, I didn't know his name until you did. So the first time I heard the name Edward Snowden was when The Guardian published that short video of this impossibly young, handsome person speaking in full paragraphs and announcing that he was the source for these stories that we had been reading about all week. That was the first time that I actually knew who their source was. I, of course, knew that they were getting on a plane to go to Hong Kong to meet a source. But I didn't, I think we all imagined that it would be someone who looked like our age and not like not a 29-year-old as he turned out to be. And the first time he and I had contact with each other, you'll remember Snowden, after turning over the archive of materials to the journalists in Hong Kong, felt that things were closing in on him a little bit in Hong Kong, and had a travel document that he had gotten from an Ecuadorian diplomat that would have allowed him to travel to Ecuador. The only way, unfortunately, to travel from Hong Kong to Ecuador without passing through a country that has an extradition treaty with the United States, and by this time he had already been charged under the Espionage Act of 1917, the only route that one could take was Hong Kong to Moscow, Moscow to Havana, and then Havana to Latin America. And we all know that his passport was canceled while he was midair on the way to Russia, that he was detained there. I don't know how many of you have read his memoir, Permanent Record. If you haven't, I strongly recommend it. But here he describes in the most detail what happened to him when he landed in Russia, which was that he was taken to a room full of what were obviously FSB intelligence agents, and essentially asked the question, are you here to cooperate with us? And when he said the most polite version of buzz off, he was stuck in what was essentially a padded cell. It's really a quarantine room underneath Sheremetyevo Airport that they use for quarantine. And remember, he was there for 40 days in this no man's land. Maybe they were hoping that he would change his mind, or they kind of didn't know what to do with him. It was during that time that he and I connected for the first time over an encrypted channel, and I asked him for and obtained kind of authorization to put together the legal team that I thought that he would need. But at the time that I first started talking to him, I thought it was just as likely that we would be defending an Espionage Act prosecution in the Eastern District of Virginia then that, he would be living free more than a decade later with a family, and having contributed meaningfully to the debate that he helped to start. So that's how I ended up as his lawyer.
Well, it's a fascinating story, Ben. In the meantime, all these years later, you seem to have developed a very close friendship with Snowden, and you probably know him better than anybody or than most people. So I'd like you to tell us something about him. You know, you've already told us a little bit about who he is and his ethics. What he's doing in Moscow now, what his life is like there? Does he have any regrets, or is he at peace with himself? And
Yeah.
at peace with his life there, which I assume he is, but I'd like to know.
I mean, I think the regrets question he's answered, which is that he regrets that he didn't come forward sooner. I think that's what you hear from a lot of whistleblowers. It's certainly what Daniel Ellsberg said. He
Mhm.
said 1971 was too late to be a Vietnam War whistleblower. I should have done it years earlier. Snowden sort of feels the same way, is that there was a period of time, a longer period of time when he was considering taking this act, and he should have done it earlier. But he was waiting to see if the system could self-correct. And kind of the two things that happened in the 6 month period leading up to his departure for Hong Kong were that the Supreme Court threw out the ACLU's lawsuit challenging an NSA surveillance program on standing grounds, saying we can't hear this because you can't prove that this program affects your plaintiffs. And James Clapper testified in Congress under oath that the NSA was not collecting any information on millions of Americans, which was, of course, a lie. And Congress, which knew that it was a lie, didn't correct him. And so he saw that neither other branch of government was actually going to do anything about it, and only the media could actually change the conversation. As far as his life now, and we'll work backwards, his life now looks a lot like mine in that he's the father of toddlers. He has two sons who are ages 2 and 3. Um, that's not easy anywhere. It's certainly harder for him there, being thousands of miles away from aunts, uncles, and grandparents. So his family is able to visit, and they do. Um, um, uh, as far as how he has made his living in the decade since he's been there, um, he has um, essentially done paid speaking engagements in order to make a living. And he used to do a lot more of them than he does now. I think in the last few years he's retreated, understandably, into family. And then also, I mean, he was quite well compensated for the memoir that he wrote. And although the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit and won their lawsuit, saying that he owes them all of the proceeds from that book that he earned because he violated his security clearance contract. But let's just say for the immediate future, they have no way of actually enforcing that judgment against him. So he lives quite comfortably, quite freely. Before COVID, I used to go over there at least once a year to spend some time. You're right. I mean, we have developed a close relationship that was forged under a lot of pressure in those first few years, and now is much more relaxed. He's incredibly funny. He is very at ease in digital communications. I, not being a digital native, being not from his generation, thought that our relationship would profoundly change when we finally met face to face. But of course, he had actually been really showing almost all of himself online in ways that I wasn't able to. And I think when we imagine Snowden in exile, we think about what it would be like for ourselves to be in that kind of exile. And all I can say is that it really is quite different for him. This is someone who joined the intelligence community when he was 21 years old, um, lived, overseas in Geneva, worked on a military base in Japan, worked for the NSA in Hawaii. He's not someone who was really embedded in a community of friends and family with whom he could speak openly about his work. He's someone who was always experiencing a huge amount of his social connection online. And so for him, I remember he said in the beginning, this isn't my most difficult posting. In the sense that, and then of course, um, if you followed his story at all, you know that his longtime girlfriend, who he left in the lurch when he went to Hong Kong in 2013, eventually joined him in Russia. They're married. She's the mother of his children. So the gamblers would say that he's been playing with house money. This is someone who thought that he would be dead or in prison. when he did what he did. The fact that he is free, that he can do public speaking, that he can be politically engaged, that he contributed again to the debate that he helped start, like all of this is more than he could have hoped. Now, would I rather that he live somewhere other than in Russia in 2024? Absolutely. One of the things that I've done is identify lawyers in about a dozen countries who are kind of on call. He applied for asylum in dozens of countries. He still, of course, would like to go somewhere else. But now that he has a family, his risk tolerance is quite a bit lower. There are things that he could gamble with his own freedom, but he doesn't want to gamble with his family's ability to be intact. And if that means being intact there, instead of somewhere else, again, it could be a lot worse, and he expected it to be a lot worse. And the last thing I'll just say about Russia is, again, if you follow him closely, he's been extremely critical of the regime there in ways that have made me very uncomfortable. I can't advise him about that, but I say, we don't really have a plan B, so why are you risking plan A? And he said, I didn't do any of this to make friends. I'm not going to compromise my integrity now, when I risked my whole life on an act of integrity. And so, there may come a day where his safety there is much more threatened, and we just don't know. But he has not been willing to, sort of play nice, just to protect himself. That's not the kind of person he is.
That's kind of what I would have expected. And I
Yeah.
want to ask another question about this, because now that he has a Russian passport and is actually a Russian citizen, is he free to travel to countries that um, have an extradition agreement with the US or
It
not? Go to
it
other
depends
people.
what you mean free to travel to, right? So the State Department has said he's free to travel to the United States.
Oh, yeah,
They would,
well, you know what I mean.
right? Well, but I mean, no, but I mean, so they would love it if he would fly to the United States, and then they would arrest him.
Right.
If he flew from Moscow to Berlin, the U.S. would immediately move for his extradition.
Gotcha.
Now, it's not clear to me that he would be extradited, right? And this kind of relates to the legal proceedings that Julian Assange was involved with in the UK. There are very serious, valid questions about whether the Espionage Act is an extraditable offense under international law. And Assange's team was litigating this up to the High Court at the time that he worked out the guilty plea that allowed that to be resolved. But we don't know how either the UK courts or the European Court of Human Rights would have resolved that issue. So, and I think the German government would say this is a question for the courts, not for the political branches. They would not just bundle him up and put him on a plane and fly him to the United States. They would let their courts deal with that issue, but it's still a big risk
Right. So that would be
to
German
him.
courts, not American.
It would be German courts followed by the European Court of Human Rights, and Germany's bound by that. And again, I think typically crimes against the state, which the Espionage Act is, are not extraditable offenses. It's crimes against individuals, right? So I actually think he would have had a better chance in the German courts than Assange had faced in the UK courts. But even there, he was getting some traction. And it wasn't clear how that was going to be resolved at the time that the US agreed to let Assange plead guilty and have time served, and go home to Australia. So look, he could travel, but it would be tremendously risky for him to do so.
And he
And
could not
that's
be protected as a Russian citizen.
uh I mean he's also an American citizen,
Right. That's
right?
true.
He's a US citizen as well. And so um uh I wouldn't advise him to do it unless he deems his current situation dangerous and unsafe. And then, of course, better to be in another country's legal system than to be in an unsafe situation.
I get that. It's interesting. The intelligence agencies in the US and UK acknowledge that there has been some benefit from the debate on privacy that Snowden provoked, but they still argue that this benefit is outweighed by the damage they claim was done. However, as Snowden has pointed out, the agencies have never cited any evidence of damage. So since that time, has the government or intelligence agencies ever cited any specific evidence of damage that Snowden's revelations have
No,
done?
nothing persuasive. I mean, if you read like the House Intelligence Committee put out a very embarrassing report in which they, sort of purport to describe damage, but Bart Gellman wrote a very devastating rejoinder to it, in which he said it was like work that was unworthy of the U.S. government. Um, Look, here's what it did. Here's the damage it did. It was very embarrassing. Um, it annoyed allies. Um, but the biggest change from the Snowden revelations, other than the legal changes, which we can talk about in a minute, is that the global tech giants who had been cooperating with the NSA in secret were forced by their global business model to become more adverse to the NSA, to have lawyers more strongly resist US intelligence requests and to harden their defenses. And so I think James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, once complained publicly that the Snowden revelations had accelerated by 7 years the adoption of encryption by commercial entities and others. And depending on where you sit, this is either harm to U.S. national security or a great benefit to privacy and cybersecurity, right? So I think that's what Snowden is most proud of, is that he essentially woke the world up to a different kind of threat model they were facing, and saying these are not just capabilities; these are practices that are happening right now. And so now it's very common for people to communicate on Signal or WhatsApp or on an encrypted messaging service. And remember, before the Snowden revelations, that was kind of almost unheard of. So it really did. Kind of change the relationship between government and big tech. Now, if your only job in the intelligence community is to suck up as much private information as you can, you would call that harm to national security. And if you take I would say, a broader and more humane view of what happened, you would see that Snowden actually made the internet more secure and made sort of great advances for individual and societal privacy and security. So no, I don't think they've ever made a persuasive case. On the other hand, they never forget and they don't forgive.
Right. Yes,
And
we do know that.
even a case like Pollard, who was the American who spied for Israel for, I don't know, $1,200 a month, and was caught and convicted. He was actually a spy, unlike Snowden, who gave information to the press. Pollard was giving stuff to his Israeli handlers. But, this is a case where you had hundreds of members of Congress who were on record saying this person should be released from prison. And he served the full 30 years of his sentence because the intelligence community they are totally kind of dead set on maintaining the kind of disincentive to people doing what Snowden did. And so, and I think the other thing here is that, these are people who are proud of the work that they do and believe themselves to be working in a very rule-bound system that has a lot of privacy protections. And after the Snowden revelations, they felt that they were seen around the world as a modern version of the Stasi. Kind of that harm to their reputation, to their ego, which I believe is sincere, and I have some sympathy for it as well, means that they will never be able to view Snowden the way people outside the system view him, which
Right.
is, maybe he could have done things a little bit differently, but on the whole, we're better off for what he did. And this was information that should not have been withheld from the public in the first place. And didn't President Obama say that this debate made us stronger? And didn't Congress change the law? after the Snowden revelations to restrict the authority of the intelligence community? And didn't a federal court say that the first program that he disclosed was illegal? And aren't those things good, right? That's not the way that the intelligence community views him. Even if they will grudgingly say, this or that should not have been classified, that doesn't at all detract from their view that he should go to prison for a long time.
Yeah, it's kind of they're like the Darth Vader of our country. And then this may be why some programs like Madam Secretary came out after this happened, where they try to show the CIA in a good light. I don't know if you watched that program, but I thought, boy, is this propaganda?
Yeah.
Just creating a whole different scene for what the intelligence community really looks like to many of us who are progressive. There are two other questions. I don't think I'll ask them both because I want people to be able to ask things
Yeah.
too. But I am interested in you, and maybe someone will ask this about the connection between Snowden and Ellsberg. But I want to ask you something that struck me as kind of funny from something that was on your ACLU bio page. And you were talking about your relationship to Snowden. And at the end of this paragraph, you say, our sensibilities are similar, but our worldviews are quite different. I sometimes accuse him of technological solutionism. He accuses me of timid incrementalism. So that fascinates me. And I'd like you to just give a brief explanation
Yeah.
of that.
Well, I think, people who are technologists um, approach everything as a problem to be solved. How do we fix this? And I've sort of tried to say to him, democracy is not a problem to be solved. There's not a handful of fixes that we're going to do that are going to kind of set this right. I mean, a good example of this is that, you will remember the Church Committee in the 1970s, where all of the horrific surveillance abuses of the civil rights era, kind of poured out, and we saw that. And what was the remedy for those church era intelligence abuses? It was to create the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, so that finally this would all be under rule of law, and that the government would have to get a warrant to do this kind of surveillance. What was the real scandal that Snowden revealed? That the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that whole process had been corrupted, and through mission creep, it wasn't individual warrants that they were authorizing. It was big programmatic surveillance where they said, you can take metadata from every phone call every day, right? So each generation kind of has to, in some ways, renew and refresh the reforms of the prior one, and that's going to go on forever, and no one's going to fix it. And so that's very frustrating to him. Why don't we just fix it? And the whistleblowing conundrum is one that everyone thinks they can just fix and you can solve it. And I say it doesn't matter what kind of system of reporting that you have and what protections you have for whistleblowers. There will never be a system that protects someone like Snowden, who was not saying, I've found this misconduct. He was saying these activities that have been approved in secret by all three branches of government, I think, are nonetheless unconstitutional. And we need to get that out into the open so that the public can be brought into the conversation, so that these can be litigated in open court, not before a court. Right? There isn't a fix to the system that will remove the risk from the kind of activity that Snowden engaged in. So we're always going to, I think people say we have three branches of government, and I say the First Amendment creates the fourth, which is the fourth estate, which is the media. And you will always need to have investigative journalists competing with the government over its monopoly on secrets, returning that information to the public and the American people. And the only reforms that we have to kind of security programs happen when the government loses control of its classification. When you have a Pentagon Papers, when you have a Church Committee, when you have Snowden revelations. And so it's always about, how do we kind of give more power to the entities in society that are watchdogs. And so that's what I mean. He thinks he views that as, timid incrementalism is a good way of putting it, right? You're the fact that you think that this can't be fixed once and for all is like, it's very alien to his technologist mindset.
And part of it is cultural, cultural
Yeah.
evolution that needs to happen to understand this kind of surveillance and control over
Well,
citizens.
I think also, it's the systems that he works in are very logical
Right. And
and
fixable.
fixable. Yeah. Yeah. And you have and a person has a lot of control over them. And so you kind of see this bleeding into government, where the very online people. In Iceland, there's a pirate party, and it's basically a party made up of hackers, and they're in government. They actually, are like the third biggest party in Iceland, and all their proposals are, well, if we make government more online and like come up with mechanisms for people to more immediately give their feedback and so, we'll fix the democracy problem. And I kind of sit back and say, wait till you see how you're going to have all the same old problems and a whole set of new ones. Ultimately, liberal democracy isn't something that can be fixed.
Not
It's
stable.
that's right. That's right. It's always going to be sort of competing interests and about making sure that there are checks and balances. And so, what did Snowden do that was great? He took these two massive, unaccountable power centers, the intelligence community and big tech, and forced them to be adverse to each other. That's good.
Yes, very good.
That's a check and balance that didn't exist before. That's good, right? So it doesn't solve, but it moves things in the right direction.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Ben. And lastly, if you would comment a little bit about the relationship between
So
Ellsberg and Snow.
yeah, I mean, and some of you maybe knew Dan, who we just lost in the last year. Um, a really amazing man and friend. And his reaction to first Manning and then Snowden was like tears of joy that he had waited decades for young idealists to kind of pick up his mantle. And I think it was 2014, and Dan said, I need to go see him. And it was an incredible group of people who went over. It was Dan Ellsberg, Arundhati Roy, and the actor John Cusack. And they all traveled to Moscow together and met up with Snowden and spent, 2 whole days talking to each other. I mean, Dan thought Snowden was such a Boy Scout and so naive. And one of the funny things that he said is, I can't believe you've gotten to the age of 30 without ever doing acid. This is this is the great Dan Ellsberg. But Dan said, when Snowden left the room, and he lay down and wept for how much he had to sacrifice. But Ellsberg always said the most important whistleblower in American history is Snowden,
Mhm.
not me. Um, the other thing people don't remember about Ellsberg is that, when he came forward, the Nixon White House accused him of the same kinds of things that Snowden was accused of. They claimed falsely that he had given a copy of the Pentagon Papers to the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. He was called a spy and a traitor in all the same ways. When Ellsberg and I did a debate together against the former CIA director, James Woolsey, Woolsey said, I used to think you're a traitor, Dan, and now I think you're a hero.
Mhm.
So I always think, time is very kind to whistleblowers and very unkind to national security claims that
Right.
that always turn out to have been exaggerated.
Well, this is really great points, Ben. I'm going to open it up to the people on the call to see if they have questions for you. I have more if they don't, but does anyone want to put their hand up? I usually can't see it unless you're using the automatic raised hand.
I see Katie with a
Okay.
hand up.
Katie, yeah, Katie, go ahead. Katie?
And please come off mute.
Yeah, you're muted, Katie.
Such an honor to have you here today. Something I've been thinking about obsessively is the profile, the psychological profile of the whistleblower, of the person who is able to stand up against collective thought. And there was a great reference I was looking for in the Atlantic, an article on the Uvalde phenomenon and how there was so much complicity and passivity there among the police. Here's my question. Do you have a thought on the psychological profile of a whistleblower? In other words, is it morality? Is it childhood passion? Is it a calling? Is it courage that is beyond most people's ability? What do you think?
I've thought about this a lot, and people who work with whistleblowers talk about this a lot too. And in a way, Snowden and Ellsberg are atypical
Yeah.
whistleblowers in that they actually remained fairly level-headed in the years after they came forward, and usually,
Oops.
all right,
Sorry, that just got, can you unmute Ben? It just got muted accidentally.
I'm going to try again.
There you
Hang
are.
on.
Okay, go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay. So yes, I said I thought about this a lot, and I don't know what you heard and what got cut off, but I think Snowden and Ellsberg are atypical in that, very often what happens with whistleblowers is at great risk and with great courage, they come forward and they have an expectation that the world is going to respond to them in a particular way. That's almost never the case. And then they get more frustrated. They sometimes get more extreme. Their rhetoric gets a little bit more out there. And, people say, what is it? Are only crazy people whistleblowers, or does being a whistleblower drive people crazy? Right? There's this way in which it comes to define their entire identity, this one act. And, I mean, just as we are more than the worst thing we've ever done, we're also more than the best thing we've ever done. And Ellsberg's advice to Snowden early on was, do not let this be your identity. Ellsberg, after coming forward as a whistleblower, ended up becoming a peace activist and getting arrested more than 200 times in anti-war demonstration, was an anti-nuclear activist, wrote books, did other things. I do think, though, that to take your question seriously, there has to be some bit of naivete or grandiosity or something. And most of us, it just wouldn't occur to us that it falls to us to change the whole course of history. And so I think in a way with Snowden, it was he is a brilliant person who was not worldly. And it was that it's worldliness is what tells us not to take that radical leap. I always told Snowden, like, it's people like you and not people like me who change the world, right? I'm going to help you, and I'm going to help you make great decisions if I can. But like my temperament and affect, I would never do that. And if you had come to me before you released the information, I would have chained you to a chair and not let you do it and not let you set fire to yourself. So there is something, I mean, that and Dan had a little bit of this too. He's like a real oddball genius. Um, uh, and yes, and there is a kind of, I mean, Snowden in his memoir talks about sitting on the floor of his grandparents' house reading Greek myths. So there's a sense of the heroic act as well. And Ed said there aren't heroes, but there are heroic acts, and that actually, though, heroic action is available to every single person on the scale of their own life. But the noun hero is very reductive way to describe a human being.
That's beautifully put, Ben. I've often thought that our obsession with heroes or need for them is part of our problems
Yeah.
culturally. So framing it as heroic acts is such a brilliant way to look at it. So I appreciate that very much. Jonathan, you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. I don't know if I have a question as much as uh, to let everyone know there's a great graphic novel by Pratap Chatterjee called Verax, and
Yeah.
it describes first the drones that were used for targeted killings, but then it gets into graphically representing through pictures like a cartoon book, the whole Edward Snowden. Uh,
Yeah, I have a copy of it on my shelf here. I just can't find it. But yeah, I agree. It's a terrific
Oh
book.
yeah. And I've known Pratap for years, and you know, I I haven't done whistleblowing under the scale that you know that Ellsberg and Snowden have done, but I certainly do it locally, and I think that Um, it for me, I think it takes courage. I think it takes great courage. I think it takes great courage for people like Ellsberg and tragedy for that matter, and Snowden to come forth and do something which they know will probably dramatically alter their lives.
Thanks for that. And I also, I mean, I know I plugged it before, but I really want to plug it again. His memoir is very novelistic. It's a real Bildungsroman coming of age story. It's about the early internet and his own idealism and the sort of you see the corruption of the internet. And in the same way he joins the military idealistically, and then has his own the scales fall from his eyes, in a way, and the book basically ends more or less before, just right around the time that this whole thing starts. So it's really the value of it is how does somebody become Edward Snowden. I really, really recommend it.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that again. I can't believe I haven't read it, but I, for some reason, didn't know about it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even though I've
I'll get you a copy.
Yeah.
I'll come up and see you, George, and I'll bring one.
Great. Thank you, John.
Autographed.
I'll call you later.
I can actually mail you. I have in my drawer, I have one time when I was visiting him, I brought a huge pile of stickers to put in books and had him sign them. So I can mail a bunch of them to Georgia, and she can
we're going to
distribute.
compete. We're going to compete your affections now.
I'll send enough for all of you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for Ben. I know we have a question from Ray now. We're almost finished, but Ray, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Ben. Thank you for this. I'm struck by the comparison of this story with the just wholesale ignoring of the national security state from the actions of somebody like Trump and his family. Basically for $2 billion they gave up Khashoggi, and they walk away with that money and nobody's said a word about it. Isn't that kind of a foreign intelligence transfer thing? The same thing with Trump and his documents problem. Oh, sure, come on in to Mar-a-Lago and oh, what about this document? Wonder what that's worth. So I just I'm astonished at how I guess selective those choices are. But my question is kind of related to the to the dispersal of these kind of revelations. And I understand that there's a piece of legislation that Jamie Raskin and some others are currently working on to add protections for journalists and getting their protecting sources and that sort of thing.
That's
so
right.
can you kind of weave that idea into what you've experienced?
Yes, again, I don't think that there is a legislative solution to the problems that we're talking about. I do think that it would be valuable for there to be some legislation that sort of solidified the best practices of not allowing the government to surveil journalists to get their sources. I mean, I was saying to Georgia before the rest of you joined, it's kind of, in some ways, it's never been easier to leak. Daniel Ellsberg had to spend, days Xeroxing documents, whereas, some have said that Snowden was able to put the entire archive onto a thumb drive that fit inside a Rubik's Cube, right, to get out. But at the same time, the capability to capture leakers and whistleblowers has never been more robust, because the government, all they need to do is once a journalist publishes a story, use their surveillance authority to find out who the journalist has been in contact with. And so what Jamie Raskin is doing, like those kinds of things, will make those practices more difficult for the government to use journalists in order to hunt down sources. But they won't fix the problem. I do think that someone with Snowden's capabilities, he probably could have gotten away with it. He's that good. But he knew when he said this that if he didn't come forward, there'd be huge manhunt in the intelligence community. It would have upended many, many people's lives. He also felt that he owed the public an explanation, that he, he's a 29-year-old person working alone. And he had to explain, for reasons of accountability, why he did it. I mean, the other thing about Snowden is that the number of documents that he released to the public is zero. He also could have published the whole archive. Instead, he gave it to journalists and said, you decide, not me, what gets published. And you do that in consultation with the relevant security agencies so that they can make their argument about not publishing. As a side note, I know you mentioned this just in your lead up to this. I have a little bit of a different view of the Trump documents case. I'm deeply, deeply suspicious of classification in general. I think less than 1% of what's classified needs to be classified. Trump had 4 years to give whatever secrets he wanted to anyone in the world. The reason why those documents were sitting in the toilet at Mar-a-Lago was not because he had a nefarious plot, but because it annoyed him that someone asked him for his documents back. And with Trump, almost always the stupidest explanation is the one that's most likely to be true. And the most baroque and nefarious one is fan fiction. And not likely to be right at all. So one of the things that annoys me about that case is hearing progressives and liberals intone reverentially about how we have to protect our national security secrets. Come on.
Yeah,
I mean, Trump is an absolute cretin, and he should go to prison for the election conspiracy, but not for having naughty documents near his toilet.
No, and for the insurrection too, it should be in jail for.
Well, my only comparison was
was
they seemed overly enthused about Snowden, but completely
Of course.
underenthused about
Or how about
a similar
Petraeus?
thing.
Or how about Petraeus, who walked?
Yes,
I mean,
of course.
Petraeus didn't serve 1 day for
Yeah.
giving, and what's more dangerous than giving top secret documents to your mistress? I mean, this is exactly what they trained you that you can't do when you're
Right.
getting a security clearance, as Georgia will tell you. Yeah.
Yeah, I did have this. Well, we won't go into my stuff right now, but well, mostly because I want people to have a chance
Yeah.
to ask
Yeah.
questions. And there's Howard has his hand up. Go ahead, Howard.
Well, welcome to my home for a second time, Ben, virtually. You were here once before with Lee Davis and Barbara
That's
Melman
right.
Davis in a book club here at the house. But nonetheless, with that said, back on Katie's question, the psychology of this. If I had a whistle and I were inclined to blow it, I would also be inclined to think that maybe my judgment is faulty and that
Yeah.
I shouldn't do this, that even though I had strong feelings that I had something that I should expose, maybe I'm wrong. What about those guys? Didn't they ever have that thought?
Yeah, and I think that's why with Snowden, he said, I have to create a mechanism that corrects for my own biases. So I have very strong views about which stuff in this archive should be public and which should not. And but I don't trust myself because I'm 29. I'm not experienced. I haven't been at this for long. And so I'm going to find some journalists, aggressive ones, adversarial ones, but also mainstream ones. And I want to make sure that it's not just one. So there's not a single point of failure. So the government can't intimidate one news organization into suppressing it. So they'll know that there's some sense of competition, that if the Washington Post doesn't publish it, the Guardian might. And if the Guardian doesn't, someone else might. But that was what he did, is that he said, look, I think much of this should be public, and here the rest of it is context. But you need to decide, using your experience, using your methods that are time tested. In the U.S., the time tested methods are journalists come up with their judgment about what's newsworthy, and then consult with government and national security officials and say, what are we missing? And they don't give those government officials veto power, but they give them a hearing and let them say, and all the journalists who covered the Snowden document said, and Bart Gellman is the one I've spoken to the most recently, that there were occasionally details that the government convinced him not to publish. But for the most part, he found Snowden more credible than the national security officials who he was consulting with. So I do think that it's wise to create some mechanism that brings other people's judgment into the loop. And most whistleblowers do. I mean, again, Ellsberg didn't publish the Pentagon Papers. He gave them to Neil Sheehan at the New York Times, right? And you know, so that's in some ways the difference between that model and what I would say is the more recent WikiLeaks model. WikiLeaks also used to work with news organizations. They stopped doing that, and they kind of stopped believing in redactions and kind of felt like they should publish whole data sets that they received. I think that's a riskier and less defensible model than acting through another trusted institution that has a code of ethics and has historical expertise in making these very difficult public interest judgments. Because remember, it's easy to say, oh, publish it if it's in the public interest, but don't publish it if you think it might, do harm to the government's intelligence efforts. And lots of the revelations do both. If you were a news publisher and you got the Abu Ghraib photos, you would feel nothing could be more important for the public to know. But there's no question that publishing these photos is going to result to the death of U.S. service people in Iraq and is going to grow the insurgency against them and is going to increase terrorism and right. But so it's not usually either or. It's very, very hard judgment calls that no individual should have to make alone.
Very, very well put. I want to thank you so much, Ben, for being with us today. This has been an extraordinary hour. I mean, I've learned a lot, and it's been wonderful having this back and forth with you and learning so much from you. I definitely want to stay in contact with you. I've been fascinated by this whole thing today, and I'm sure everyone who's hearing it now and who will hear this later will feel the same. Is there any last few words you want to say to us before
there's so many threads that came up today that we could have pulled on for a whole hour, and we just didn't get a chance to do that. But I always find it inspiring that people who don't do this for a living will take an hour on an afternoon just to be more informed citizens and better activists. And so thank you all for that.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. I'm going to stop the recording now.